Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
It's great to be here. I want to thank the student committee especially, who's worked very hard to pull this off, and all the sponsoring organizations, and the faculty who are taking part. I'm a big fan of the Veritas Forum because I believe important questions really need to be discussed openly and in a friendly manner all throughout the academy. And I love the way they model this kind of discussion, so I'm very happy to be a part of this event tonight. I was driving down the Wilbur Cross Parkway one day, and I saw a bumper sticker. It said, "Language is not transparent." So I thought about it for a few minutes. And I thought I understood exactly what it meant. It wasn't about a political candidate. It wasn't about the Red Sox. Go Red Sox. It was about language. And it made a particular claim about language, a claim that it seemed to me like I understood. And I got all this at a glance, driving 55, okay, maybe 65 miles an hour on the Wilbur Cross. There's a widespread view that language is ill-suited to carry meaning or to be a vehicle by which we can explore the world and say true things. And this widespread opinion leads many people into various kinds of relativism. Now, there are all different kinds of relativisms, and I'm going to talk mostly about two different kinds. But first, I want to set aside a whole group. Some people are what we could call selective relativists. That is, they are relativists about some things but not others. So you might think that moral claims are only true relative to a culture or to an individual. But you don't think the same thing is the case for scientific claims or historical claims. That's a kind of selective relativism. Because the title of our talk tonight is True for Me, but not true for you, I don't want to focus on selective relativisms. I want to focus on truth relativisms. The other kind of relativism that's not selective is a truth relativism. Relativism about truth. And that makes a kind of universal claim. Every claim is relative to something else. Now, there are two kinds of truth relativisms that we can talk about. There's what we can call common truth relativism, and for lack of a better term, what I'm calling sophisticated truth relativism. Now, I know you all want to be sophisticated truth relativists and not common ones, but I'll explain the difference. Sometimes common truth relativism emerges from disagreement. We find ourselves in disagreements, yet we're very hesitant to say that someone else in a discussion is mistaken or has a false belief, or their values are not what they ought to be. So then we kind of use the phrase, well, that's true for me, but it's not true for you, or that's true for you, but it's not true for me. In common truth relativism, we take that phrase literally. We mean that certain things literally are true only relative to the people doing the believing. Now, normally, common truth relativism is not individualistic. It's cultural. So it's not that just because I believe something that makes it true, but what is true is what my culture or my community holds. And so truths are deemed to be relative to our culture. There's also sophisticated truth relativism, and it's probably easier to see what this means by putting it in contrast with what we could call a traditional or a realist concept of truth. So the traditional or realist concept of truth is the idea that most of the sentences we say, if they're going to be true, are true because of something objective, something that's outside of our concepts, our opinions, our beliefs, our cultures. So for example, I brought props. You need to have props. A hammer, very helpful for fixing things around the house. And a turtle, not so helpful. So the realist about truth is going to make a sentence like this. There are two objects on the table. What makes the sentence true? Well, it's the fact that there are two objects on the table. This fact is independent of my concepts, of my desires, of my beliefs. So that's the traditional or the realist concept of truth. Now let's think about sophisticated truth relativism in relation to this. The realist says that my sentence is true if it turns out that there really are two objects on the table. The sophisticated truth relativist says the exact same thing. My claim that there are two objects on the table is true only if there really are two objects on the table. But where the sophisticated truth relativist differs from the realist is whether or not there are two objects depends on our concept of object. So whether or not the fact obtains depends on the concept of object. So most of us would readily say this is one object and this is another. But what if we had a different concept of object, where there's the hammer and there's the turtle, but then any two objects near each other make up a third? We could call it a hurdle, right? Then the answer to the question, how many objects are there on the table, would be there are three objects. And that would be true relative to the concept of object we're employing. Now, I use this example because some of the philosophers who work in sophisticated truth relativism use these very kinds of examples. Hilary Putnam, Michael Lynch, they talk about the concept of object, how it's relative to our conceptual scheme. The sophisticated truth relativist thinks there's no true concept of object. So my sentence, there are two objects on the table, is true relative to one concept, false relative to another. So why might someone be a relativist about truth? I'm going to talk about two reasons. One is some people think that the common sense or the traditional or the realist picture of truth cannot be defended. They think, look, we are so embroiled in our perspective that we cannot step out of our perspective and compare our perspective to reality. We only access reality through our perspective. So therefore, everything we think and believe is relative to those perspectives. That's one reason. Secondly, I think a lot of people adopt relativism about truth because they think it holds forth or supports certain values that they feel are important. And these are the values of pluralism. It gets very dicey to say that one of your friends is wrong or mistaken in her beliefs. But if truth is relative to concept, then we can say, well, you're right relative to your concepts, and I'm right relative to my concepts, and we don't have to be in an adversarial relation with our friends. These reasons indicate some of the wisdom that's found in relativism. First, it is true that our thinking and our believing and our investigating the world is deeply embedded in our perspectives, and it's wise to recognize that. Secondly, it's wise to think hard about the values of accepting the other, the person who differs from us in belief, practice, values. So the question, is there wisdom to be found in relativism? This is where it's to be found. But I don't think these reasons are very good for adopting relativism. The fact that all of our thinking is from the vantage point of our perspective doesn't mean we cannot stand outside our perspective and engage it critically. In fact, this very conversation is an exercise in doing that. We reflect on the way what we believe and value is shaped by our perspective. So it's possible to stand outside, maybe not perfectly, but adequately to critique our own perspective. Secondly, I think relativism actually undermines the very values it's trying to support. Let me explain. Suppose I make a claim that God exists, and you make a claim that God doesn't exist. It seems like we disagree. But what the truth relativist is going to say is, my claim is true relative to my perspective or culture, and your claim is true relative to your culture. Ultimately, we don't disagree at all. We're talking about different cultures, different perspectives. It seems like we disagree, and so there's a real difference. But in the end, we don't. Once disagreement disappears, pluralism disappears. The only basis for pluralism, if we hold forth and value a real difference of opinion and value. But on a relativist view, those real differences are erased. Another criticism of relativism is that the relativist herself makes absolute claims. So I say, God exists, and the relativist tells me, God exists according to your perspective. But if I were to say, no, I believe God exists objectively, independent of my perspective, the relativist has to say that I'm mistaken. Because there are no truths for a truth relativist that are true independent of perspective. So the relativist is telling me that I'm mistaken. How is that relativistic? How is that not as absolute as any view on the market? There's an internal incoherence with the relativist position. Now, this event was advertised as a conversation between a Christian and a pragmatist. Nothing that I've said so far is connected to Christianity at all. But if we think about Christian theism for a few minutes, we can see that it brings resources into our thinking about truth that are valuable. A lot of sophisticated truth relativists articulate their position by saying, there's no God's eye point of view. Well, if God exists, then there is a God's eye point of view. Human points of view are not the ultimate points of view, right? And the Christian story, the theistic story, it's shared with other theistic religions, is that God creates the universe, and it's real and it's objective. Secondly, if theism is true, the world is knowable. We can get knowledge. Because the theistic story, not just Christian theism, but other theisms also. The Christian story, the theistic story says, God knows the world fully because he's all-knowing, and he made us to be knowers. Not that we can know perfectly, but we can know adequately. He put us in a knowable world. Third, particular to Christian theism, if Christian theism is true, then the Truth Project is part of our quest for human flourishing. When Jesus said the sentence, "The truth will make you free," he was talking about our freedom and flourishing is combined with the value of truth. So let's think about why that might be the case. The quest for human flourishing is a quest that requires a truth perspective. We have to diagnose accurately the obstacles to human flourishing. We need accuracy, we need a truth perspective. The task of loving other people requires a truth perspective. Think about what your friends want for you. If you have a good friend, she doesn't just want you to be happy. She doesn't just want you to be satisfied with your life. She wants your life to be worthy of your satisfaction. She wants you to live the best life possible. That requires a truth perspective. And if we are to value the other, people with whom we disagree, we need also a truth perspective. We need to value the differences because it's true that people have intrinsic value. If any view that says the value of persons is only relative is going to be very hard. It's going to be very hard to sustain our values for the long haul. So, there are different kinds of truth relativisms. Some of the reasons we're motivated to consider them highlight where there's wisdom, but fundamentally, I think there's kind of an incoherence in the relativistic project. Christian theism can bring some resources to broaden our perspective about the nature of truth, and it's something that's worth thinking about. Philosopher Roger Scruton said, if someone tells you that there's no truth, he is asking you not to believe him. So don't. Thank you.
So first, we might be tempted to see a couple contrasts here which would be too simple. One is that Greg is the Christian perspective here, and I am the pragmatist perspective, and to treat those as contraries. In fact, pragmatism is sort of on a different axis from Christianity. There have been some very important pragmatist Christians and some pragmatists who don't participate in Christianity. Right. And second, it would be misleading to think Greg is the realist and I'm the relativist. So that said, I am committed to finding what's valuable in a line of thought and reflection. So I'm going to do my best to vindicate some of what seems most valuable to me in something like relativism. I do not care whether you call what I suggest relativism. Okay. But let me go ahead here. Does that work? Okay. So what I'll do broadly is to suggest that insofar as we take a knowledge-focused point of view, much of the line of thought that Greg presented will hold good. I'm going to introduce a wisdom-focused kind of philosophical concern and suggest that it raises very different questions from a knowledge-focused kind of inquiry, and that when we think about wisdom, there's a little bit more room to be concerned with relationality, and it's relationality that lies at the root of the word relativism. Okay? And so I'm interested in relationality with respect to what we say and the value of what we say. So, however, but insofar as knowledge is our concern, then I think if you got a bullhorn saying all knowledge claims are thoroughly relative, there's something self-undermining about that project, something incoherent. And yet that may not be the only thing that's going on here. So I take this lesson, right? You can see it from there, right? So this is all well and good. We need to be able to think critically, and there's a kind of relativism that suggests that whatever you think is true for you. But I don't think any of you think that way. However, many of you may assume that when we're talking about what's a good thing to say, the main question to ask is, what's knowledge? What's true? And a knowledge-oriented question starts with a what. What do I know? Right? And when we think about knowledge, we're mainly preoccupied with propositions. What I mean by propositions is something that stands outside of language, something that's ideally timeless and more clear than language itself can be. Okay? Something you can accept, grasp, hold. Right? So you know something, you have it. There's a sort of possessive idiom or metaphor going on in a great deal of talk of knowledge. Once you have it, you can claim it and you can express it. Right? So we've got a sort of individual focus. What's in me and what do I then express? Right? That's one kind of discourse, and if you choose that discourse, many of the kinds of lines of thought in Greg's presentation make sense. To know is to believe what's true. You can't possibly have a notion of knowledge as distinct from belief unless you think truth is part of what makes the difference. Not only must your belief be true, but you've got to hold it for the right reasons. Those are the three sorts of elements in a canonically philosophical account of knowledge. Okay. So what one can know is a proposition. What a proposition suggests is something that's behind language, a sort of an encoding of facts that's perfectly clear. So if I say something like, the water's running, that is something that if I said it here and somebody else said it over there, somebody else said it over there, wouldn't represent the same proposition, right? We'd have to ask exactly which water are you specifying? What do you mean by saying it's running? Yada, yada, yada. But a proposition would be like that ideally crystallized expression that fills in all the details and then furthermore says something like, but even deeper than that, because it doesn't have to be said in English, right? So we say the same proposition in, say, English and in Spanish. If I say it's raining and somebody speaking Spanish says está lloviendo, we're saying the same thing, right? The same proposition. That's the idea. So what matters most about propositions is distinguishing the true from the false, okay? And when you're thinking about knowledge, you're asking, which ones of these things do I want in my head? As if they're sort of things that you let in and then you can express. They sort of set up house there in your head. And you're thinking when you're evaluating ideas, does this belong inside me or not? There's another way we can think about what we say or what words mean, which is to focus not on the propositional content, which is supposed to be this timeless reflection of facts behind language, but on the specific things we're saying in particular moments. So each time I say something is a different time, and every time I say something to myself, it's a different time. Talking is an active process in time, in space, in social interactions, and we can ask, how wise is it? How wise is it to say this thing at this time in this interaction, as opposed to, is it a true thing? Is its content true? Okay. And the main question in a wisdom-oriented approach, let me just point out, so philosophia is interested in wisdom. So, and I know Greg is interested in wisdom, in suggesting that you're focusing on knowledge in contrast to wisdom. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm not discounting your interest in wisdom, but there's a kind of practical wisdom which is different from a concern with true contents of belief inside the head. So wisdom starts with how questions. Does this? There we go. Right. So how questions, more than what questions. Not what do I want in my head, but how do I interact with people? How do I communicate well, engage well, pass along the kinds of things that I recognize and that I prioritize? How will I do these things? How will I participate in a verbal interaction or a social interaction? So every time I say something, I make a shift in what my audience is paying attention to. Am I doing that well? Am I doing it wisely? It's a different question from, am I saying something true? With what I say, I can ask, am I helping to coordinate your activity? Am I enlarging the world of your perception and your agency by tuning you into things that you otherwise wouldn't be tuned into? I can think about those things without an appeal to truth in any propositional sense. Okay? So instead of thinking of little objects in my head, I think of processes going on all the time in our thinking. Impulses, thoughts, reflections, and the question is, which ones of those will I articulate? Which ones will I choose to pass along? Which ones will I give more credibility? So, a variation on relativism. Not something's true for you or true for me, but not for you. But something really might be wisely said to me, but not wisely said to you. And, or wise at one time, but not at another. Okay. So we could think about it this way. We've got a sort of Venn diagram here. There's the stuff that's true. Do you know what these asterisks mean? So there's the stuff that's true, and there's the stuff that's aptly said or wisely said. And sometimes things might be both true and wise to say. Sure, there's stuff in that intersecting zone. But of course, there's plenty that's true that's not wise to say at any given moment. Some stuff that's true that there may be no appropriate occasion to say. It really never is worth directing attention in the way that saying that thing would involve. And then, of course, there are things that might be wisely said that are not true. Now, what I'm talking about is not deception. Not, there are some times when you ought to say something that's a white lie because it will get you some result, or it's clever, or it protects people from the truth. On the contrary, there might just be lots of ways in which what we say is imprecise, but it gestures in the right direction, and hence it moves people's attention in the right direction. You're almost out of gas, and you want to get to the post office before 9 o'clock when the Hartford post office closes, and I say, but that's 25 miles away. False. It's not. It's 23 miles away. Is it close enough? Well, the whole thing about truth is it wants to draw a clear line. Okay? Wisdom about what to say when does not need such a clear line between what's true and what's not true. It's circumstance responsive. Okay? And of course, there are lots of things to say that are neither true nor wise to say. That's obvious. Okay, so I want to get to a sort of an interesting live question. This is right down the street, by the way. I saw this a few weeks ago. It's a billboard at a local house of worship. Earth has no sorrow, heaven cannot heal. Is it true? What do you think? I'm just, not necessarily that you need to say, but I'd like you to reflect on whether you think it's true. What I find is that the question whether it's true is not the most interesting question. Right? What proposition does it express behind the words, and is that proposition reflective of reality? I find that to be very unpromising as a way of thinking about the value of that billboard. Instead, I want to ask, what communication is it making? And is that a wise kind of communication? And the wisdom of saying something like this varies with the audience, the context, the time. And of course, one charitable reading, as we say, there's no grief so profound in earthly life of human beings such that some sort of spiritual healing is impossible. In other words, no matter how deep your grief, there are ways of moving through it spiritually. Something like that. Right? That would be one gloss that seems to be maybe helpfully said in somebody's direction. Right? But there's another way in which it might be taken up quite dangerously. Right? You think about what happened, this is at Grand Isle off the coast of Louisiana, after the oil spill, and you see, think about the sorrows of the earth. And you say, there's nothing going on earth that heaven can't fix. And I say, well, that would be a very profoundly dangerous implication. Do we want to say that it all depends upon the speaker's intention? So, but they really meant one thing rather than another. The thing about a wisdom focus is we can't be oblivious to what comes across, how things might shift attention away from some things and towards other things, right? So if we denigrate the earthly realm, we subtly suggest in some ways that the ways in which the earth is suffering are not really so important. Okay? No suggestion that that was the intention, right? Or that that's the interpretation of that sign. But the wisdom question is a much more practically engaging and difficult question than whether it's true. Propositionally speaking, is this true? Being gay is a gift from God? How about this? These warring billboards in Toledo here. Okay? I'm really not all that attracted to figuring out what the propositional content is behind these two billboards. I can think of ways in which each might reflect a helpful communication in a certain context, right? And yet a very, very unhelpful communication in other contexts, okay? I think there's a good Christian on the left. Really, if God hates signs, God is in good company. There's a lot of philosophers who've said things to that extent. Wisdom usually abhors a public placard or a bumper sticker. Anything that's broadcast is broadcast without respect to audience. And in fact, one thing I don't like about giving a big public talk is I'm actually not able to tune in to all of your faces at once and figure out where you're confused, where I might be saying something that's misleading to you, right? Books, even books that spend a lot of time elaborating their point of view, can fail to communicate. Here's a claim: God is not great, right? By one of the authors that Greg takes on in his recent book. Is it a helpful claim? I'm much more interested in how constructive or not constructive it is to make that intervention than whether it's a true claim. There may be ways in which it's true. I'm not in much of a position to know. I think I don't have much access to truth about those claims, but I have a great deal of ability to reflect on how well it communicates. I don't think this does so well in most cases. There may be contexts in which it does, right? But I find this to be deeply problematic as a broadcast message, okay? So just to close, I think, I'm at a closing point, right? So Socrates is somebody who suggested that when words are in writing, they're dead. It's like a painting. It looks like there's a person there. It looks like there's some sort of connection, but it's flat. There's no depth. It can't tune into who you are as a reader. And all communication is a relationship between a speaker and a listener. And to figure out what that listener can hear and how you need to modulate that message and shape it so that it's taken up well is a much more difficult question than to figure out whether you're confidently speaking the truth. And so we'll think that some speech can focus on wisdom, and that's an equally valuable question. So thanks.
Okay, this is how we propose to proceed from here. We'll let Greg have a chance to respond to Elise for 5 minutes, and then Elise to Greg. And then the three of us will have a conversation, and then you will get involved.
Okay, I loved Elise's presentation. I agree with everything, right? The truth question and the wisdom question are very different. One time my wife Jeannie and I were driving in a parking lot, and our son Nicholas was about 3 in the car seat strapped into the back, and I commented to Jeannie, "We'll never find a parking place." And about 4 seconds later we hear, "Oh no, what'll we do? Where will we go? Are we ever going to get home again?" Right? I mean, so it wasn't an apt thing to say because he took me literally, and of course Jeannie understood. It was perfectly apt for me to speak to her this way because she understands the exaggeration, the hyperbole about what's going on when you're trying to find a parking place. Paying attention to the aptness or the wisdom of speaking is, I think, a message that's crucially important. I actually believe it's connected to the truth question, because what makes something wise depends on assumptions about value, about persons, and about the effects of our communication. I think I don't want to pick on Christopher Hitchens' title of his book because, for all I know, the publisher made him do that. Because I've had to fight with publishers about titles, but anytime we have a bumper sticker or a sound bite that's broadcast, as Elise said so articulately, we are in grave danger of being unwise. And that's a real challenge in our public life. The Socrates quote is fascinating because that's before there was a shift from oral media to print media. The print media really emerged, for the most part, with Gutenberg, but now we've shifted to image media, so that everything is in sound bites and bumper stickers, and very little attention is paid to the wisdom in our communication. So I commend Elise for articulating this. I would argue that what makes something wise depends on certain assumptions that are going to be true or false. Generally, we don't think about them, but the care to treat one another wisely in our communication is grounded on the assumption that people are valuable. Now, I believe that's an assumption most of us think is true. So I don't want to separate the wisdom and truth question completely, but it's certainly the case that our uses of language are not restricted to articulating facts about reality. For a long time, philosophers basically said that at least that's the main thing that's going on. But by the 20th century, more and more philosophers were thinking, look at the different ways we use language. So I commend Elise on this, and I find we really don't disagree about very much on this.
Maybe I'll point out that the history of discussions of relativism with respect to religious belief is a fascinating one with twists and turns. And among the thinkers who are associated with relativism, we find, of course, folks like Nietzsche, who's associated with the claim God is dead. But we also find Emerson, whom Nietzsche admired, who was very much part of the Christian tradition, albeit in a broad and unique way. And we also find William James. Right? William James was actually an apologist for religious belief, who said, after in some ways following up on Blaise Pascal's argument, believing in God is a good idea. There are good subjective reasons for it. The payoffs are greater than the costs that you might incur if you're wrong. Okay? Well, I do have a concern that if we say relativism is a really messy thing, here's a package of belief that really gives you a solid metaphysical framework from which you don't have to look back, right? That there may be a way in which we have postponed the question, should I bite? Should I take on that body of belief because it so securely grounds my confidence that there is a true point of view and that I'm made to appreciate its nature, right? And whether that's so is not something that I'm prepared to say in a categorical way, that belief in God is an irresponsible way of handling your freedom, or that it's a really responsible way. Right? I just want to point out that there is a level of responsibility involved in making the choice to step into a whole system which promises to ground your confidence in your relationship to truth.
I would like to ask our two speakers who are philosophers, and I am not a philosopher, as I imagine quite a few of you are not. To think a little bit more about the sociological situation in which we find ourselves, and what they think is really the state of play of relativism in our culture. A couple of them seem to assume that we are not naive relativists and so forth. But the students chose this question, presumably because they thought that relativism was a very live issue among Wesleyan students. And I teach African history, and I find it quite interesting that when students return from a semester in Africa, they've often done research on aspects of African culture that are very troubling to them. I'll take one example, female circumcision, which is often called genital, what do they call it?
Mutilation.
Mutilation, thank you, yeah. And they struggle with it, but in the end, they almost come to the relativistic, almost always to the relativistic position. Mm-hmm. They end up abandoning a belief that they had, undercutting, it seems to me, the possibility of asserting any kind of universal doctrine of human rights. So I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, how much relativism is there in our culture? How serious is it? And how, as philosophers with very similar views, it seems, can we combat it if we need to? I know those are three questions, but I thought maybe you could pick up some part of one of them.
Well, let me suggest that if we take the distinction between there actually being a relative truth and one being uncertain how to discern the truth, or which I would want to translate one step further, being uncertain what's wise to say, okay? When one's uncertain what's the wise thing to say, our culture gives us the language of relativism as a fairly neat package within which to represent that lack of confidence and sort of hedge on things and say, there's something that I'm picking up on that seems wrong. That much they're not disavowing, but it's not clear to me that it would be better if I were to express it with the confidence that I have about certain other matters. All of that can be the case without relativism being true. So, or a good doctrine. In fact, I think as a doctrine, it doesn't make sense. I see our work philosophically and as good cultural critics as being to give people better ways to talk about that encounter, better ways to voice their concerns, besides a standoff between my belief inside me and your belief inside you. How will I communicate the concerns that I have without assuming that I have the righteous access to the perfect view?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much right. I think a lot of the relativism we encounter in our culture is fairly shallow, and it becomes a default for situations like this when I don't know what to say, or if someone is confronted with very deep differences very rapidly. I don't think very many people are, I tried to make the distinction between common relativism and sophisticated. Some people conclude that relativism is the best policy based on their thinking, but many people just kind of absorb it as a way to navigate these kinds of things. But I would also agree that even if we don't know what to say or what's wise to say, that doesn't mean we don't think that there is some answer to the question. There's a fact of the matter about universal human rights and whether or not they're being violated in a certain situation. We might believe there's a fact there, but we're not confident that we've figured it out. There's a big difference between figuring out a fact and then speaking persuasively to help people change behavior. And to speak persuasively, I believe, we need to speak gently and kindly and charitably and try to engage the concerns that motivate people to do things that we think they ought not be doing. So figuring out the fact is a challenge. But then it's a whole other challenge to think, how do we engage people in a way that's going to be fruitful and not just with a bumper sticker?
It's appalling the degree to which you seem to agree with one
Can't explain it.
But you're also, it seems to me, a trifle complacent, both of you. You seem to feel, well, we have a nice balance in our culture between wisdom and knowledge, and they'll mingle with each other, they'll support each other and be used at appropriate times. I know I'm caricaturing and so on. Is there nothing wrong with the present situation?
I think there's very little wisdom. I think we have a lot more knowledge than we have wisdom. I think the way we run most of our public discussions is unwise, uncharitable. It's very easy to turn people with whom we disagree into enemies. I remember receiving fundraising letters from opposite organizations that were obviously written by the same fundraising organization, right? The opposition is well organized and well funded. The same sentence was in both letters. And I thought, the desire to cast someone with whom we disagree as an enemy of some kind, that is deep and rampant. You never hear an actress after winning some award saying, you know what I'm going to do for the next 3 years? I'm going to think about virtue. Or a politician saying, I've really got to think about what my opponent said there. I've got to really reflect on that to make sure I have a good response. We believe this kind of wisdom. It seems like our culture believes it's a weakness. And I think we need to rehabilitate the virtue of wisdom. And so.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there was one image that I thought would come up there, but if it went by too quickly, I didn't comment on it. There are some questions that can't be Googled or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's very clear that we have a knowledge-driven culture. And paraphrasing Lao Tzu a little bit, for knowledge, add. for wisdom, subtract. We have an accumulation of stuff that we want to put in our heads, and when our heads are overflowing, we want to put them in our phones and in our bookshelves and so forth, and in our hard drives. Right? So we have an accumulation culture rather than a thought about where am I going and where am I redirecting others in order to navigate this flood of information we have. Right. That's one reason why I think this preoccupation with truth may be itself, truth as a touchstone, may be bound up with a sort of fetish for getting more knowledge. Because if I can be sure it's true, then it must be valuable, right? Right? So give me as much of that currency as you can. Give me as many of those pennies of little things that I know that are true. I think that focusing on not the propositional content, but what am I doing? What's the intervention I'm making when I consider a thought or tell myself something, that takes us in a very different direction that I don't think is part of our culture.
Yeah, and this is where we might disagree a little bit. I don't think our problem is we're too caught up in the Truth Project. I think that would be a great first step to get caught up in the Truth Project. I think most people in America, which I can speak to, well, I can't speak about most people. It seems to me many people are navigating their lives without concern for what's true, especially about the important questions. So there's a big difference between information and truth. In fact, the virtues that we need to develop to master the information age are the very ones that are going to make wisdom impossible, and the pursuit of truth impossible. Because you master information, you manage it. Speed is of the essence, but both truth and wisdom require reflection, care, interpersonal discussion, and consulting wise people from all over. So I think that the Truth Project is very different from the accumulation of information and the managing of information. So I see the truth issues much closer to wisdom than Elise has just expressed. The more we reflect on what's true and why do we have a good reason to believe this when it talks about important issues such as human rights and the value of even the least of the people that we encounter in the street, those truths begin to shape us in terms of acting with wisdom. Whereas the accumulation of information can make it impossible for us to pursue truth or wisdom, I think.
Mm-hmm. So what we're looking at here is some tension around the role of knowledge in generating action as opposed to reflecting the kinds of commitments, habits, and relationships that we already have. Right. So for example, to take treating you lovingly and with dignity. I don't do that because I love you. Did you all know that I had that relationship, Greg?
We're old friends. We're like this.
Sorry, I didn't say that right. Yeah. I don't do that because I know you have intrinsic value to treat you with respect, right? It's something I do, and my words, you have intrinsic value, are a marker of my commitment to the practice on a sort of a pragmatist way of thinking about it. And so truth is sort of an abstract praise we give to the kinds of things that we say in harmony with ways of going on that are very complex.
And may I respond?
Oh, please.
You know, I think that's good, but I think when the pressure's on, the truth of the intrinsic value plays a stronger role. It's one thing for us to be comfortably sitting around and enjoying one another's company. We're not tempted to treat each other poorly. But if I'm running a large corporation and I realize I can make a lot of profits by treating the least of my workers in a slightly exploitive way, there's pressure on, right? Because profits make me happy, right? Exploiting workers is something I can do without really thinking too much about it. But then it becomes the truth of the intrinsic value of a worker that reminds me to act wisely and to check my greed in the face of something that's true. So that's where truth and wisdom come together, when the pressure's on. When there isn't a lot of pressure, then we don't even have to think about the fact that we value one another and we believe we have intrinsic value. Because you just don't treat people that way. That's the way we talk about it. No, you just don't act that way to people. But when the pressure's really on, why not? I could make a lot of money. Well, you know what? Intrinsic value of human beings. They are not to be exploited. And that's where the truth has more traction, I think. Anyway, your turn.
Well, I'm happy to take questions
Yeah.
because it seems, yeah, we may have.
Thank you very much for your wonderful discussion. I think there is sort of a very interesting thing going on here that both of you try to sort of divert or attention from what Professor Ganssle called selective relativism. Thank you. So the idea of selective, so the problem with absolute or sophisticated truth relativism is very nicely put in that if you say every statement is relative, then your statement is at Russell's paradox, which self-reflects, self-referential to be non-true. But so, and many others have worked on this problem. For instance, Gödel with his incompleteness theorem, that you need at least one axiom for every system to be logically coherent. And as such, I think Gödel not only suggests that you need some kind of axiom for consistency, but he actually tells you how you can achieve consistency. That is to provide at least one axiom for your system. In that way, I feel like the attack on absolute relativism might not work so well if you just take that one piece of puzzle in there, in that, if you say, so the three of you, the group of you take one axiom as a starting point, and the three of us take another axiom as a starting point, we don't need to disagree on our things, but we are relatively correct in our own perspective. We are all very coherent in our own systems. And in that sense, Gödel says to us is that we can all be very coherent, yet we do not need to sort of conflict with each other. So in that sense, I do not see that there is a sort of a complete rejection for absolute relativism. It depends on you construct it. So if you set up a straw man argument where everything is relative, well, that's certainly wrong. But if you do it with some bit of care, I think you can do it. And my question for Professor Springer is...
yes, please, may I urge you to focus the question very briefly?
Sorry?
Could you please focus the question very briefly?
All right. So the question is, why would you argue that first of all, that there is absolutely no absolute relativism. The second would be, well, even if that's the case, what kind of selective relativism would you accept as a Christian philosopher? My question for Professor Elise is that...
could we just leave that question for the time being?
I'll start very briefly. Clearly, if we choose different axioms, we can come up with different coherent systems. But that doesn't mean that those systems are true, right? This happened with non-Euclidean geometries, right, with the parallel postulate, and discovered that there are perfectly coherent geometries that have different axioms. And then it turned out to be an empirical question, what is our space like? And it turned out it's non-Euclidean, but that doesn't bother us trying to drive around campus, right? It's Euclidean enough for us to get home. So there's a difference between coherence and truth on this. And I don't think I was setting up a straw man, because there are many people who try to put forward a truth relativism. I mean, Hilary Putnam is one, Michael Lynch is another, Richard Rorty is another, although Rorty will deny relativism because he's thinking about common versions of relativism. So anyway, that's enough for me.
It seems that I'm not actually sure that the articulation of truth relativisms, when they try to go global, is ever clearly enough stated to avoid serious problems. That is, can a proposition itself be only relatively true? I don't think anybody's claiming that, but that would be what it would take. It's always sentences, actual things said in places. And of course, a sentence may be appropriately uttered in one context and not in another, right? Selective relativism strikes me as a quite straightforward thing to embrace with one caveat, which is that people who embrace a selective relativism, say about moral truths as opposed to scientific truths, will often go on to say what a moral truth is relative to, such as a culture or a religion, right? Or a system of moral axioms, as it were, right? And it's not at all clear to me that those cultures, religions, or systems of axioms are remotely as coherent in the social world as they are in geometry.
Right.
Okay, and so selective relativism, to the degree that we're saying there are certain domains such that you really should never evaluate truth without asking about context, yes. But whether you can set that context so neatly that then you have a determinate template to say, there, relative to the Christian point of view, that's false. Christianity is complex, right? Yes. Anything that you name as the reference point is going to turn out to be textured and complicated for important questions.
Right. Here's a question for Greg. What about the Christian faith is considered an objective truth?
I think many of the central claims. I mean, I don't want to give a list, right? God is real. God acts in history. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. I didn't make that one up. That one's in the New Testament. Jesus is fully God and fully human. These are meant to be objective truths. Now, they could be false. And so Elise's last point in her response to me, that it's not enough to say that theism helps ground the Truth Project. No, you want to have reasons to think that it's true before you jump into it, right? Of course, that's for another Veritas forum coming next year to Wesleyan campus. Somebody will talk about that maybe. But yes, so the fact that Christianity puts forward objective truths doesn't mean that they really are true. But if they aren't, then it's mistaken. It's wrong about these things. And of course, Christianity is widely complex, as Elise said. And there's nobody who's only in the Christian community. I'm also in the community of analytic philosophers and the community of people who hate going to the Department of Motor Vehicles and the community of people who live in Connecticut, right? And the community of people who love to watch Monk reruns, right? I mean, I'm in a lot of different communities and they all shape me in different ways. And this gets to Elise's last point. I think she's right about this. When we try to specify how those communities work to shape these perspectives to which certain claims are supposed to be relative, it gets very, very difficult. I hope that's helpful. Go on.
I'm not sure that it follows with some of the central tenets of Christianity that either they're true or they're false. This is where I want to suggest it's much more interesting and practically important to focus on the role that those particular utterances are playing within communities and relationships than it is to focus on truth. So Jesus Christ died for my sins. I actually have no handle on how to get at the truth of that, except by saying there are contexts and conversations within which I see the role that it has to play, and I'll say, right, there's a narrative on which when I teach Kant, I sometimes say, Jesus Christ died for our sins. And when I teach Kant's work on religion, there's a very clear sense in which I can explain how that's true. But what I mean is how that's an apt communication to make, how that focuses our perception and attention around the sort of common human fabric that makes up our moral lives, such that one person senses that I can't be so righteous as to say, oh, you're the sinner, I'm not. And I think there's an insight there that's captured when Kant says something about how Jesus Christ died for my sins. But to say that it's either a Christian claim that's true or a Christian claim that propositionally is false leaves me with very little sense that I have traction on that question.
Greg, in his talk, in showing the weaknesses of relativism, first made the big claim, of course, that it's self-refuting, which I presume you accept.
As a doctrine, right? But I see relativism in its most interesting form, not as itself a claim.
No, I understand. But then he also claimed that the theistic story grounds the whole truth, the search for truth and the possibility of truth, that God creates, that what he creates is real, and that we are beings created to understand that. Do you have any comment on that claim?
I do have a suggestion that one of the things that is wise to say to ourselves, and that's a sort of gloss on belief, right? Something I say to myself, my future self, something I draw my attention to. One of the things that's wise to say to ourselves is that it's possible for us to learn. And whatever imagery I can conjure up to engage in dialogue in a direction that's hopeful towards convergence is wise imagery in the practice of human communication. Right? That doesn't mean that I need to believe that there's some sort of proposition about human nature that grounds the practice, but there are ways in which we postulate the possibility of harmonizing our perspectives and reflecting on our shared world accurately in the sense of in ways that enhance our perceptive and active lives in a very organic fashion.
And there's a sense in which I'm going to agree here, because the points of Christian theism that can ground the Truth Project are these claims that are held forth as objective truths, but that's not their only function. Right, and it's not, and it's not. Christian theism is not the only way to ground the Truth Project. So I'm not saying that unless you embrace some kind of theism, you're going to be in a morass as far as truth's concerned. I don't believe that's the case at all. But clearly these claims are held forth as truth claims. They're not merely strategies to help us grow as Christians, to point us to the future in terms of learning. They are also that, right? Anyone who wrestles seriously with the claims that God made a world, made us to be knowers, and set us free in this world to learn, is going to sense a deep enthusiasm for the project of exploration and navigating our lives wisely, right? And so the function of these claims is far broader than the truth claims, but the way Christian theism holds these things forth is not less than as truth claims. And we might simply disagree about this factor, but I'll go on record saying that's what I think about it.
I have 3 questions here, which I think have been somewhat touched on in the conversations. So if someone in the audience has a question that is quite different, please do present it, and be brief, please.
I had a question specifically for Professor Springer, and I guess any of you still can answer it. But in terms of absolute relativism, for example, let's say we observe animals, and at the end we can decide what's best for them in some sense. You know, you take an animal, a dog, and then you see, does this X, Y, and Z, what's best for it? Eventually, through studies, we'll notice what's best for that animal, and it becomes, just for this sake, let's say it's the truth. In the same way, you take mankind and you can observe mankind and see that it has a truth too. So how does that fact, if we were to assume that that's true, that we can take an animal and know what's best for it, claiming that it's the truth, why can't that connection work for a human? How is absolute relativism compatible with such scientific proofs in that sense? In the animal stage, what I'm saying, let's make the analogy to the mankind stage.
I'm a little concerned that you may have taken me to be defending absolute relativism. I'm not. I take absolute relativism to be a doctrine. It's a claim about claims that has exactly the kind of incoherent or self-undermining character that Gregory suggested. Okay. However, I would say instead of thinking about, well, we learn the truth about dogs, and in a similar way there's a truth about human beings. See, that might be so, but we may gain more or we may appreciate our situation more by saying we learn to become attuned to dogs. It's a practical attunement to their flourishing. And we learn to be responsive to their cues. right? That's more important, this responsiveness to their cues, than getting the right sentence in our head about what's good for dogs, right? And I'm not saying that that anybody is quite that simplistic, but a focus on truth suggests sort of accumulate the facts. And I want to say, in some ways, the facts are a distillation of something that's much more embodied and much more practical, which is an ability to pay attention to the life process of dogs, and similarly to the life process of human beings. And so there are truths about what's good for us, but we don't treat each other well because of truths. We treat each other well, and then we have things to say about that wisely. Those things we say with relative convergence, we can call the true things to say.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Very good.
Okay. Here.
I'll try to be brief. So in terms of objective truth as something that we all want to know, and in particular with Christianity and the afterlife, what happens after death, our own mortality and dealing with this. That particular objective truth as to whether or not there is an afterlife is something that we cannot actually know until we die. That's, I think, no matter how you argue it, that objectiveness of that nature, that question is, you can't deal with it until the day you die. However, I do have a question about the types of truth that we can tackle in terms of while we are still here on this earth. And to that particular question, I guess, is why it is that we need to say that this is selective relativism, or this is the actual truth, or Christian doctrine is truth, or things along those lines. And by that, what I mean to say is, I personally believe that we all have faith, essentially. And I don't necessarily mean that in the sense of spiritual faith, but it's a faith in something. And so I have a hard time understanding how it is possible to ask any objective truth of our own particular life here, when the only objective truth or question that I can find is the one about our own mortality that we all share in. That's the one thing that grounds us together. But besides that, everything else is relative in my mind. And I guess in this sense, what I mean to say is that faith is the one thing that keeps us together in another sense, in the sense that that's the only basis for which we can find understanding or truth. And I have two examples of that particular instance. One would be science, and one would be your own personal morality and ethical questions and things along those lines. So for the first, it's a question of, I imagine we all have loved ones. We all have people that we care for dearly. And some of us want that love reciprocated. And the problem with that is you can't actually know whether or not someone that you love loves you back. You can't. No matter how you...
June, please put it in the form of a question, okay?
Right.
One sentence question.
Right. So what I mean to say is, because you can't know that someone loves you, or because you can't know that the concept that you believe in particular, like the laws that Einstein or Newton have presented, because you don't actually know it, and rather you believe it, and you have a faith basis on that particular subject matter, I guess, what would be the alternative to absolute relativism in terms of our particular...
That was a sentence. It was a long one.
Thanks. First of all, it sounds like you're saying that if we don't have absolute certainty, we can't know, and then we just have faith, which is a position, but it's not the position that was really held by any philosophers, right, or major Christian thinkers. Right? Faith was always a means to knowledge. It was knowledge based on authority. I mean, I know about Newton's laws because I believe the books I read. Right? Now, those are reliable authorities, so it's a well-grounded faith. It's not a wild faith. You know, most of what we know, we believe on the testimony of others, and that's sufficient for certain kinds, for many kinds of knowledge. On the afterlife, I don't think that's the only thing that binds us together, mortality. And there are plenty of other ways we could have a good case to believe one thing or the other. Plato has some arguments for the immortality of the soul, and you might find them persuasive. I could tell you why I don't, if we had more time. You might have some arguments that a human person is purely physical and dissolves at death. You could have philosophical arguments. Someone could die and come back and talk to us about it. That's what Christians think Jesus did. That would be some good information. So it's not, we have to consider that it's not just a matter of our own experience. But I think the real challenge of what you're saying, it boils down to this: if we can't have certainty, we don't have knowledge. Therefore, it's faith. Therefore, it's some kind of relativism. And I would want to put the brakes on right away. I think we don't have to be certain of things that we know. This was the wrong turn Descartes took in the history of philosophy. We know things if it's reasonable, if they turn out to be true, then it could be, if we have sufficient evidence, it could be knowledge. Once you say you need certainty to have knowledge, you get caught in an infinite regress of a vicious variety. But that's complicated epistemology. But I think that's all I should say if you want to say anything else.
I mean, I think in some ways the way that your line of thought reflects what happens when you start with knowledge as your central reference point. That is, you start by saying, what can I know? What am I going to take in? Right? What can I really incorporate into myself? Oh, is this legitimate? If you think of it as a yes-no question about what to say to yourself and what to say to others, then you set up a potentially impossible ideal of the perfect threshold after which there would be no more doubt. But if you think about what you say and how the thoughts that go through your head as part of how you act in the world, the sense that, oh, am I going to think or am I not going to think, becomes moot, right? You're always representing in the sense of having an internal dialogue, having words, and you're always sharing words with others. And it's not really a question of what's legitimate or not legitimate, but really what's better and worse at tuning you in, tuning others in to the kinds of things that you notice, that concern you, etc. And so I think I want to just suggest that if you take wise practice as your primary question instead of knowledge, right, you won't be quite as puzzled about how it's possible to have a meaningful conversation about important things.
I think we have time for one more question from another Wesleyan graduate. And then let me say that at the end of that, I think Joyce is going to sort of end things, and there's food, right? Okay. Our Wesleyan graduate.
Dr. Springer, I would just like to congratulate you on your wisdom for having chosen this august institution for your undergraduate education. I too am an alumna. I'm older than you are, though, and so my gray matter won't move as quickly as yours.
But age is good for wisdom. For wisdom, subtract.
I don't know. You haven't gotten there yet. You just wait. I, however, in addition to being old, I am not a philosopher. I'm a theologian, so I'm sure I'm going to get something wrong, so I'm hoping you can help me. And Dr. Ganssle, I don't know what in God's name you are talking about when you talk about Christian theism. I'm not asking you to explain that. I'm just saying I don't get it. And you can tell me later. He and I are friends. But when Dr. Springer talks about yes-no questions as maybe not being the most fruitful, and that not all Christian claims we want to look at as being either true or false, I, in my own study, think back, and it's not only a matter of history, it's still happening, the martyrs who die for their Christian faith, for whom there is a yes or a no. So there, I think maybe it's a moral question, this matter of truth, and it's bordering on the question of suffering, which you brought up, which is a huge question for people who can't deal with, how could God let this happen to me or to other people? So I think you pointed to that question, and it's important. When you showed the slide that said, earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot heal. Now, That sounds incredibly crass and insensitive unless you understand the Christian narrative. It sounds ridiculous, in fact, and dangerous, as you pointed out, and I would use the word immoral. Don't we then have, my question is to both of you, don't we have the moral obligation to teach truth and falsehood, to be able to say that's not what that means? There's a specific narrative that starts with God's creation, that ends with God's consummation, that heals, that does heal. But it's not, you can't say that in such a way that, oh, you know, these animals that have been affected by the oil spill, don't worry about them because God will take care of them. I mean, it seems to me we do have questions that are leading us to make decisions. Is this true? Is this false? Here I stand, I can do no other. You know, still today, I mean, I met a bishop from South Sudan, the newest country in the world, whose people are daily having to stand and deal with questions of truth or falsehood. And it seems to me it is a moral question. So I guess my concern and my question for you is if we don't see questions in terms of truth or falsehood or taking upon ourselves the obligation to answer in terms of yes or no, doesn't that somehow involve us in complicity of evil? I don't know, but maybe there's no such concept of evil if you don't say false, true. I don't know. I'm not a philosopher.
Clearly, where people risk a great deal for what you call the truth, there is a moral question at stake. And there are things worth sacrificing for. And the word truth may be in our culture about the highest word we have to talk about what demands our respect, what sort of pulls me independently of my own antecedent desire, right? What sort of needs to be tuned into, right? Regardless of whether I might have other things going on, you know. I would love to know more about what the martyrs died for. My guess is it wasn't truth in the ordinary sense of accurate representations, right? What they wanted to do, I actually think that self-martyrdom could be understood as a communicative act, right? Yes, yes, or risking being brought down, right? As in, say, Martin Luther King Jr. You act in such a way as to call attention to what matters. So I would say the salience of one truth or one important thing that people need to be paying attention to, right? The need for people to pay attention to racial injustice, say, is important enough to marshal great sacrifices. I'm not sure whether a lot is at stake and whether we say there's a truth there that was sacrificed for, as opposed to a profoundly important problem of human neglect or an irresponsibility, right? So there's a lot of practical vocabulary to think about what a martyr is doing that may not boil down to dogma or propositions or some sort of representation independently of the context of my drawing attention to something through my action.
I guess we'll give you the last word. Do you want to comment on martyrdom or on Catherine's suggestion that you don't understand theism?
Okay. Yeah, okay. I could say about theism, but I won't. This is where I think the wisdom and the truth question can come apart for someone who's in a martyrdom situation and believes something that's true and is being threatened to recant that truth or to be killed. Maybe the wisdom question is still operative, but the criterion for what counts as wise is shuffled up quite a bit, right? What's wise is what preserves my life, or what's wise is to live faithfully to these things that are true, whether it's racial equality or in South Sudan, these people, it's their commitment to follow Jesus. So what counts as the wise life is wrapped up intimately in the truth question. And I think if there's a disagreement between Elise and myself, I think they're much more closely intertwined, and perhaps she thinks they're farther apart. Neither of us devalues wisdom or truth. It's a matter of what is their relationship. So I would, if I get the last word, I'm going to say it matters deeply that we learn to live and speak wisely. And that's the best commendation I could leave you with.
I suggest a round of applause for both speakers.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.